From 1878 to 1968, there were 71 lake captains that called Bayview, Wisconsin, on the shore of Lake Michigan, their home. While they lived here, they captained 195 different ships, from tugboats to schooners to steamships, in voyages that took them to every one of the Great Lakes. Join us now for another episode of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, where we explore not only these captains, but also their ships, their homes, their families, and their lifetime of sailing adventures on the Great Lakes.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, where we talk about the 71 different lake captains that once lived in Bayview, Wisconsin from 1878 to 1968 in the age of sail and steam. This episode, like the others, is presented by the historic Bayview Lake Captains Society. Now today, I'm standing in front of not a Bayview Lake Captain's house. Oh wait, I thought this was about Bayview Lake Captains. Well, this one is maritime, and it's definitely maritime Bayview with a national and almost worldwide perspective or effect. Now, this is not the original house of this story, but the location is the same. So that house that applies to this story was torn down and this one was replaced, but I'm on the right location for it. The story involves a 20-something electrical contractor that took a job out in, of all places, San Francisco at the shipyard in Mare Island. The story takes place in 1900. And he went out there to do repair work, electrical, which is very early back then, repair work on a very famous Navy ship, one of the most famous Navy ships in all of U.S. Navy history. And that ship was the USS Hartford. Now the USS Hartford is famous because during the Civil War, it was commanded by Admiral Farragut, who during the Battle of Mobile Bay, down in Alabama or Mississippi, forget exactly which one, but you'll find out here coming up for sure. During the Battle of Mobile Bay, Admiral Farragut directed the Union forces that were trying to blockade the harbor and seize the harbor. He stood out on the rigging. One of the ships had encountered a mine, which in those days were called torpedoes. And he ordered the fleet ahead by saying, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Now, most people, even if you're not in the Navy, have heard that slogan, and it's renowned today in the Navy and even naval circles in the world, with many other famous officers that in similar situations have rallied their sailors that way. And so anyway, this famous ship is in long after the Civil War, is in San Francisco for maintenance. Frederick B. Williams, the electrical contractor that lived in this house, took that job in that San Francisco shipyard and worked on that ship. And then he finished the work, but remained on board for some fine-tuning during the voyage, which was to go from San Francisco around South America to Boston, just before the Panama Canal was built. So he was basically what we call a shipwrighter, and has continued his work, final details on that voyage all the way around, and got off the ship in Boston and came home. So truly an amazing story, and highly significant in Bayview's maritime history, so I thought I'd tell you about it. All the details coming up with Simon Stanhope, our narrator from England. And with that, I'll sign off and say hats off to our Bayview Lake captains. Bye-bye, and I will see you in the next episode.
Welcome to another installment of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, where we discuss the lives of the 71 different lake captains that once lived in Bayview, Wisconsin, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in the age of sail and steam. This discussion will include their ships, their homes, their families, and their lifetime of sailing adventures on the Great Lakes. Here is the map of lake captains' homes in Bayview, to show you where this episode takes place. Its location focuses primarily on the large green arrow. Today, we will not be discussing the life of a Bayview lake captain, but instead a very significant maritime event in the life of a young Bayview electrical contractor named Frederick B. Williams. He was likely in his 20s when this true story occurred, in the spring of 1900. He maintained his home of record with his parents at 636 East Otjen Street in Bayview, though the house there today does not appear to be the original. Little did he know that the contracting job he took that spring would end up providing him with what could have very well been the greatest experience of his life: the opportunity to sail halfway around the world on one of the U.S. Navy's most famous warships. Frederick B. Williams of Bayview wasn't a sailor, but rather an electrician, possibly an apprentice, hired to work on what may have been new electrical components of a shipboard steam propulsion system. Given that electricity in 1900 was still in its relative infancy, less than 2% of the entire U.S. had functional electricity even 10 years later, in 1910, this may indicate Mr. Williams had acquired significant talent for his age, though what company he was working for, and how he may have gotten this special skill, especially for maritime applications, is unknown. In the spring of 1900, Frederick was a contractor doing work in a shipyard on Mare Island in San Francisco, California, on an older U.S. Navy ship, the USS Hartford, which by that point had been relegated from being a frontline combatant to a training ship. The Hartford had recently undergone a major rebuilding program, but then appeared to have been taken out of service temporarily. It was then reactivated as part of a decision by the Navy to move the ship from the Pacific over to the Atlantic. It was work associated with this reactivation effort that Bayview's electrician Fred Williams was a part of, though he could also have been involved in its previous recent major upgrade work. The U.S. National Park Service provides this summary of the Hartford's overhaul at Mare Island. Quote, USS Hartford spent 9 years at Mare Island, from 1890 to 1899. From 1894 to 1899, the ship underwent a major rebuilding effort. On October 2, 1899, Hartford was reactivated and transferred to the Atlantic, this time to serve as a training vessel for midshipmen. Hartford served this purpose until October 24, 1912, when it was transferred to Charleston, South Carolina, to serve as a station ship. Unquote. Because he listed his home at this time as still being in Bayview, exactly how Mr. Williams came to work in California and when is a mystery. He may have been sent to San Francisco by a local Milwaukee company, perhaps to its California affiliate, but this is unknown. It's also possible he may have answered an advertisement about the job and been recently hired during the ship's 5-year rebuilding process that began in 1894. This may have included training as an apprentice by the San Francisco shipyard doing the work, but this too is unknown. Regardless how he got to San Francisco to take on the job, the fact that he returned home to Bayview after the ship rebuilding program was completed may indicate his contract ended at that time. In Williams' case, this would have been when the ship arrived in Boston from San Francisco. The USS Hartford was originally built in 1858 before electricity. Whatever Frederick Williams had to do aboard it in 1900, towards the end of the previously mentioned 5-year rebuilding process from 1894 to 99, a lengthy 42 years after the ship was built, may have involved upgrading or repairing previous attempts at electrifying the ship. Pre- and post-Mare Island shipyard, available photos show the ship with taller masts and a smaller smokestack after the rebuild. This may indicate the original steam plant the ship was built with in 1858 may have been replaced with a new one using electrical service, hence the need for Williams' contractor position. Due to his young age, he was probably an apprentice to a senior electrician. As the rebuild of the USS Hartford neared completion, it would not have been at all unusual at the time, nor even today, for a few contractors to remain aboard, finishing up as the ship left the pier, and got under way in the spring of 1900. Fred Williams was one of these. So, Bayview's Fred Williams continued his work by remaining aboard as the USS Hartford left the pier and sailed out of San Francisco Bay, destined for Boston by the southern tip of South America and the Caribbean. The Panama Canal wouldn't be completed for another 14 years, 1914, so ships like the Hartford had to go the long way around. While en route to the tip of South America, the ship stopped at Robinson Crusoe Island. Yes, that Robinson Crusoe Island, which is in the southeast Pacific, 400 miles west of Chile on South America's western coast. Very briefly, for those that might not be familiar with the story, Robinson Crusoe was the name of a world-famous, best-selling adventure novel published in 1719 by English author Daniel Defoe. The book caused an international sensation, and Defoe became an instant celebrity. It has been in continuous publication since 1719. That's over 300 years. To this very day, every person in the world interested in the maritime subject knows of Robinson Crusoe. Its pages popularized the real-life adventures of a Royal Navy officer named Alexander Selkirk from Scotland, who became marooned from 1704 to 1709 on the uninhabited island of Massa Tierra, later renamed Robinson Crusoe Island, in the Juan Fernandez Islands archipelago off the coast of Chile. He survived there alone for over 4 years, though the book has him living there for 28 years, before being rescued. There is a statue of him today at the site of his original house on Main Street, Lower Largo, Fife, Scotland. Because the USS Hartford anchored in the bay of Robinson Crusoe Island for a port call during its voyage that summer of 1900, Bayview's Frederick Williams had the opportunity to go ashore and visit the island. When the Hartford weighed anchor to depart, with Fred Williams back aboard, it sailed for Chile on the continent and stopped at several ports there. Williams got to see those too. Continuing its voyage south, the ship approached the very end of South America. But rather than sail around that very southern tip, named Cape Horn, the USS Hartford, with Frederick Williams still aboard, instead sailed through the Strait of Magellan, just above the Cape, a shortcut from the Pacific to the Atlantic. About 300 miles long, it was discovered in 1520 by Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan, as part of his attempt to circumnavigate the globe. He died halfway through, though one of his ships succeeded in the circumnavigation attempt. This shortcut is important because it saves from having to sail around the infamously dangerous Cape Horn, renowned for its gigantic seas and gale-force winds, as the Pacific and Atlantic collide. In history, perhaps the most famous example of the horrible wind and storms faced by sailing ships was when, in December 1787, the HMS Bounty tried for over a month to make it round Cape Horn, without success due to the ferocity of the wind and waves, having to turn around and abandon the attempt. Another example is provided here, taken from Wikipedia, that quotes author Richard Henry Dana, Jr. in his book 2 Years Before the Mast, providing his first-hand experience attempting for 9 days to round the Horn from Boston to California on the brig Pilgrim, before finally succeeding. Quote, "Just before 8 o'clock, then about sundown in that latitude, the cry of 'All hands ahoy!' was sounded down the forescuttle and the after hatchway, and hurrying upon deck we found a large black cloud rolling on toward us from the southwest and blackening the whole heavens. 'Here comes Cape Horn,' said the chief mate, and we had hardly time to haul down and clew up before it was upon us. In a few moments a heavier sea was raised than I had ever seen before, and as it was directly overhead, the little brig, which was no better than a bathing machine, plunged into it, and all the forward part of her was under water, the sea pouring in through the bow ports and hawse-hole and over the night-heads, threatening to wash everything overboard. In the lee scuppers it was up to a man's waist. We sprang aloft and double-reefed the topsails, and furled all the other sails, and made all snug. But this would not do. The brig was labouring and straining against the head sea, and the gale was growing worse and worse. At the same time, sleet and hail were driving with all fury against us. We clewed down, and hauled out the reef tackles again, and close-reefed the fore topsail, and furled the main, and hove her on to the starboard tack. Here was an end to our fine prospects." Unquote. It is because of these examples, and more, that the USS Hartford decided to take the shortcut using the Strait of Magellan. The ship's steam-powered propeller made it possible to navigate its narrow parts and treacherous currents, a task much more difficult for sail-only ships, whose better option for this reason was to try the Cape. Of interest, while sailing through the strait that summer of 1900, the USS Hartford actually anchored for a while near a huge glacier field, the largest in the southern hemisphere besides Antarctica. This shows, in addition to the wind and storms, just how harsh the conditions found at the southern tip of South America can be. Exiting the Strait of Magellan, the ship entered into the Atlantic Ocean, and then continued sailing up through the Caribbean Sea and past Barbados, en route to its final destination of Boston. As the Hartford docked in Boston, Frederick Williams would have been finished with his work and departed the ship, his contract complete. For Bayview's Frederick Williams, this had been not only a significant voyage, but also a truly amazing adventure. But what makes Williams' time sailing aboard the USS Hartford especially memorable is that it had been Admiral David G. Farragut's flagship during the U.S. Civil War, where he gave one of the most famous orders, if not the most famous order, of any officer in the history of the U.S. Navy: "Damn the torpedoes! Full speed ahead!" The following summarizes the circumstances and background behind Admiral Farragut's famous words aboard the USS Hartford. On 5th August 1864, during the Civil War, at the Battle of Mobile Bay, Alabama, the Union Navy was trying to seal off the port, which was the Confederacy's last lifeline for supplies from overseas. In those days, sea mines were called torpedoes. The Confederate Navy had heavily mined Mobile Bay to try to keep the Union Navy out. Admiral Farragut was undeterred, ordering his fleet into the bay anyway. He climbed up into the rigging on the USS Hartford with his spyglass to get the best possible view in order to direct his ships. One of these ships entering first was the monitor USS Tecumseh. It hit a mine or torpedo and sank. All the other Union ships near it stopped. Through a megaphone, Farragut hollered to the captain of the closest ship to him, Captain Drayton of the USS Brooklyn, to ask what the delay was about. "What's the trouble?" yelled Admiral Farragut. "Torpedoes," replied Captain Drayton. "Damn the torpedoes," hollered back Farragut. "4 bells, Captain Drayton. Go ahead." Then Farragut added, "Jouet, full speed." The name Jouet refers to Captain James Jouet, who commanded the ship USS Metacomet, that was also in the formation with Farragut's USS Hartford. After these words, Admiral Farragut ordered his flagship USS Hartford to lead the way into the minefield, and the other ships followed him into the bay, not one of them being hit by the enemy torpedoes. Farragut's fleet also dodged fire from enemy coastal batteries guarding the harbour entrance. Once they made it into the harbour, the Confederate fleet was waiting for them, and a battle ensued. The Confederates were defeated, with an incredible 12 of Farragut's crew receiving the Congressional Medal of Honor for their heroic actions during the battle. 4 months later, U.S. President Abraham Lincoln promoted Farragut to Vice Admiral. Admiral Farragut's fighting words were not unusual for Navy leaders encouraging their crews in battle. There have been many similar examples over the centuries by other naval officers across the world. Captain John Paul Jones, USN, yelled from his ship, the frigate USS Bonan Richard, in reply to the enemy demanding his surrender, quote, "I have not yet begun to fight," unquote, in 1779, during the American Revolutionary War. 26 years later, in 1805, on the other side of the Atlantic, the Royal Navy's Admiral Horatio Nelson sent up signal flags to his fleet from aboard his flagship HMS Victory that informed all crews on all ships that, quote, "England expects that every man will do his duty," unquote, just before the battle was joined at Trafalgar. Only Nelson's HMS Victory still remains intact today from among these other ships mentioned here, in this segment on which all these famous words were spoken. Finally, during the War of 1812, U.S. Navy Captain James Lawrence of the frigate USS Chesapeake told his crew, quote, "Don't give up the ship," unquote, as he lay dying during a fierce battle with HMS Shannon. These are but a few of the many famous orders given throughout world naval history. In summary, then, here we have a Bayview resident, Frederick B. Williams, who lived at 636 East Otjen Street with his parents, not a sailor and not a lake captain, securing a ride aboard easily one of the most famous ships in U.S. Navy history, the USS Hartford. And it wasn't just a safe and casual ride inside the breakwater, either. No, Fred Williams sailed aboard Admiral Farragut's famous flagship from the Pacific, around South America to the Atlantic, and up through the Caribbean to Boston. The total length of this voyage, if stretched into a straight line, would be about halfway around the world. And it was aboard Admiral Farragut's famous flagship where he gave one of the most famous orders in U.S. Navy history. So, because of a 20-something electrical contractor in 1900, just 36 years after the Battle of Mobile Bay, the residents of Bayview, Wisconsin, are able to say today that they have a connection through one of their own with Admiral Farragut and his ship, the USS Hartford. Yet another piece to be added to the already great and substantial maritime history of Bayview. There is a postscript to this story. The USS Hartford continued to linger on after being decommissioned in 1926, ultimately being moved to Washington, D.C. in 1938, where it was subsequently abandoned. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, once a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Woodrow Wilson, had a passion for the Navy and wanted the Hartford preserved, along with a surviving ship of the Spanish-American War, the USS Olympia, and a U.S. Navy destroyer, name undiscovered, but possibly the USS Patterson from World War I. Thus, FDR would have saved a prominent ship from the 3 US wars prior to World War II. Unfortunately, when President Roosevelt died in 1945, the USS Hartford fell into disrepair and sank at its mooring in 1956. It was subsequently dismantled, with many items being saved and preserved in museums across the USA today, including the ship's wheel and fife rail on display at the U.S. Navy Museum in Washington, D.C., and several important belongings of the Admirals that were with him aboard the USS Hartford, to include his desk, cash box, and cabin panels, now held at the Farragut Museum in Farragut, Tennessee. The Admiral was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, but fought for the Union during the Civil War. The town of Farragut, formerly named Campbell's Station and near his Knoxville birthplace, was subsequently renamed after the Admiral on the conclusion of the Civil War. As for the destroyer President Roosevelt was also trying to save, it suffered the same fate as the Hartford, and today there is no World War I U.S. Navy destroyer still in existence. But there was one success. Thanks to FDR's direct order in 1942, the USS Olympia was saved from scrapping and is today a museum ship in Philadelphia. Thanks for watching. This photograph isn't about Bayview or its lake captains, but it's from the same era of Great Lakes maritime history. We thought we'd close with it for enjoyment, as it captures the spirit of the era. If you'd like to read more details about Frederick B. Williams' voyage on the USS Hartford, as well as the sources for the information contained in today's video, you can find these and more in the book Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, for sale now, by individual volumes on both Amazon.com and HenschelHouseBooks.com. All proceeds from book sales go to support various maritime history projects related to Bayview's lake captains. One of these is a plaque and marker with the captains' names and addresses on it, as part of the creation of the Bayview Lake Captains Historic District, which will be the first of its kind in America. If you would like to contribute to support these projects, to include this and other markers honouring Bayview's lake captains, with 100% of all donations and contributions in all forms going to support them, please consider contributing to us through the listings found on our website by pressing the Contribute button. Note, we are not a 501c3, so contributions are not tax-deductible. If, for some reason, we are unable to secure these markers, then all funds donated to this site will be given as a cash donation to the museum ship SS City of Milwaukee in Manistee, Michigan. This is the only surviving intact ship that was once captained by a Bayview lake captain, and in its case was captained by at least 2, and likely 3, totaling over 20 years between them. Finally, we also have free self-guided walking tours of Bayview's 71 lake captains' homes, using only your phone. It's simple and easy. Just go to our website shown here, find the item on the menu bar at the upper left named Free Self-Guided Walking Tours, and then scroll down to find the map with instructions. Zoom in by street. When you find a captain's house you're interested in, click on it and details appear on the right, along with a link to the YouTube episode from this channel that provides the biography of the captain that lived there. You can also read about his sailing adventures while living in that particular house by going to the website menu item, Sailing Adventures, and looking up his name. It's free, fun, and available any time you're out walking. Just bring along your phone. I'm Simon Stanhope, narrator for these episodes. Join us again soon for the next chapter of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains.